Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this week's lesson of the Mini-Bootcamp. So today we are on lesson number 7. We're going over JavaScript in even more detail tonight. For anyone who is just joining us for tonight, I want to tell you a little bit about what Lambda School is and what this bootcamp is. So Lambda School itself is a full computer science and web development immersive. So we offer both a 6-month full-time course and a year-long part-time course in the evening. And so both of those courses will prepare you for a job in the software industry. So we learn everything from front-end to back-end development. You'll learn how to build a full web app. You'll also learn some computer science topics. So it's a really great course just to teach you everything you need to know to get hired in the field. And what's really cool about our course is that it's a de-risked education model, which means that you don't have to pay us anything up front. If you want, you pay 0 at the beginning, and then over either the first year or the first 2 years after finding a full-time job in the industry, you can pay us back. And so something that occurs as a result of this model is that we are incredibly motivated to get you hired. So you might be wondering what some of the things we do to ensure that our students are hired. Apart from making sure that we only bring awesome people into the program, we also have a full hiring team. So we'll help you with resume development, online presence, LinkedIn profile. And in addition to that, we also have hiring partners. So we have companies that we work with directly. So we're able to kind of slip you guys in the back door sometimes. So it's a really great education model. It's a really great course, and it's going to teach you everything you know. So this mini boot camp is a little different. So this boot camp is totally free. It's just the fundamentals of front-end web development. We teach you CSS, HTML, JavaScript, and then we'll do a little project next week. And it's free and open to the public. It's a great way to get ramped up and ready for our main curriculum. It's also just a great way to learn. So if you are interested in our main curriculum at Lambda School, we do look upon people who have taken this, this mini boot camp in a really high regard because it shows us that you're serious about it. So if you're interested in the full-time course, reach out. We'd love to get you started on the application process. And if not, just enjoy the videos. So, and if you are new with us tonight, it might be a little tough to jump in right now because we are on lesson 7, but everything is online. So feel free to check out some of the previous videos. All right, well, let's not delay any longer and let's go ahead and jump into what we're going to talk about tonight. So last night, we went over arrays, and arrays were your first introduction to data structures. While we had previously seen, different variables, different types of data we can store in JavaScript, an array was the first time that we really saw a way to store multiple pieces of data that should be grouped together in kind of one associated unit. And arrays are really great, but objects are even more powerful. They're a different data structure. And that's what we're going to look at tonight. So let me go ahead and share my screen so we can jump in and get programming. Okay. So let's just do a little brief review of arrays from last night because arrays and objects are pretty similar to each other. So what we learned last night will definitely help us tonight. So if we want to create an array, it's similar to declaring any other variable. We use our whichever declaration keyword we want. I'll use const, the name of our array, and then these 2 hard brackets. And whatever we want the array to contain goes inside of here. So if we wanted to do students, like we saw last night, we could go ahead and throw the names of our students. inside of the brackets. So we can declare an empty array, like we just saw, or we can go ahead and populate it from the beginning. So each item inside the array is going to be separated with a comma. And then once we have an array, we can use properties such as students.length to find out how many people are in our students array, in this case 3. We can also use methods like pop which removes something from the end, or push to add someone in. And so as we saw last night, this is a really great way to store like items together. We save ourselves a lot of time and energy by having all this great functionality already built in for us by using the array data structure. So now we're going to move on to objects. And before I jump in and show you how to declare objects, let's just talk for a minute about what objects are. So they are another data structure. And as a reminder, the word data structure just means a way of storing multiple pieces of data that are related. So whereas an array is essentially just an ordered list, we take like items, and the only thing we're really saying by putting these items in an array is that they're similar to each other. They're all of the same type. They're all students. And we are also potentially saying that there's an order. So in the case of this example, there really is no meaningful order. But if I change this from students to say appointments, because first I had an appointment with Jim, then Anna, then Bill, now we're using the order property. So objects are a little different. They are not ordered, so they are not a great way to store ordered data. But what is really cool about them is that they add labeling. So let me show you what I mean. If I wanted to create a collection of information called my info, and say this has my name in it, Deandra. Perhaps it also has my email. And maybe it also has my hometown and the city that I currently live in. So this is a little different from some of the examples we've seen because these items, they're all related because they all have to do with me, but they're all kind of different too, right? This is a name, this is an email, and especially these last two are confusing because they are both cities, but one's my hometown, whereas the other one's my current location. And we know that because I just said all that out loud, but there's nothing about the data structure itself that tells us that. And if this thing just popped up and we had no context, we really wouldn't know exactly what it was telling us. So that is where an object is super useful. So I'll go ahead and comment that out and create a myInfo object instead. So objects, we declare them just like any other variable. And then instead of using the hard brackets like with arrays, we use these curly braces. And then instead of just putting one value inside, we put key value pairs. Let me show you what I mean. So instead of just having my name floating by itself, I can say this is a name. And then I could do an email. And then I could also specify that this is my hometown and current town. So now there's no ambiguity about what these things mean. And that's really useful. And you'll find that data often comes in this form where you have related bits of data, but they all have sort of this different quality that requires labeling. So if you ever have a question about, do I use an object or an array? Two things you might ask yourself are, is the data ordered, in which case an array is good, or does the data require some sort of more detailed labeling, such as this, in which case you would use an object. Now, before we move on, let's break down the syntax in detail. So we saw that it was similar to an array in that we have our variable declaration, we have our assignment, and then we have brackets. So in this case, curly brackets. It's also similar to an array in that we have our value pairs separated by commas. And notice that we're allowed to put a comma on the end, even though we haven't put in anything after current town, which is really nice because you just always end every line with a comma. What used to happen before JavaScript updated is you'd have something like that, and then you'd throw in another value, and then you'd forget there was no comma, and everything would be broken. So this is really great, and I would utilize the fact that we can now throw a comma on every line, even the last one. And then these pairs, we have our key, which notice I didn't have to use quotes. I can just say name. We then have a colon, and then following that, we have whatever value is here. And while I've used all strings in this, I could also throw in number. I'm not sure if that has the right amount of numbers in it, but we'll pretend that's a phone number. We could throw in a number, and that works too. So with arrays, we could also mix types. With objects, we can do that as well, but it actually makes a little more sense here. I could even do awesome, true. So we could have a Boolean, we could have a number, we can have strings, we can even have functions, which I'll show you a little later. We could even have objects as values inside of objects, which starts to get a little meta and confusing. We won't go over that tonight, but just know that that's a thing we can do, and it ends up being super useful as we get deeper into this. So now that you know the basic syntax of how to declare an object, let's talk a little bit more about everything that we can do with it. So just like an array, you might be thinking that we want to look up stuff in it. So remember that, let's comment this out for a second. If we wanted to look up information in an array, we use the number system. And that's why it works so well with ordered data. So my info at 0 is going to be the very first value because we have 0 indexing. If I wanted my email, that. And so using the lookup with an array is another good indication of why arrays are not great for storing this kind of data, because you have to know, you have to memorize what the order is of this information in order to look it up. And that's not very intuitive. Whereas over here with our object, we use a very similar lookup system. So we can also use brackets just like that, but instead of putting in a number, we put in the actual key name. So look at that. And now we don't care what order all these things were put in. We just need to know what is the key name, and we can look it up. And also similar to an array, we can use the same notation to reassign. So if I'm like, oh no, I left off the full name of my hometown, let's reassign it. And then if we go ahead and go hometown, you see it's been updated. And now that we've thrown in a console log, this is a great opportunity for me to give you a little word of warning, which is that one of the downsides of objects is that, oh, it looks like it's working out there. Sometimes when you console log an object, it just prints out something that looks like this. That's not very informative. So that's a little word of warning. Sometimes you'll see that when you're trying to log an object. It's just one of those annoying things. This usually happens if you have a really complicated object that has multiple things nested in it, but don't worry about that too much. Yeah, we can see that this has been updated as expected. Another thing we can do is we can delete, and we can delete based on keys as well. So if we went ahead and threw the keyword delete on here, so let's take a look at that syntax. It's just the word delete, the name of our object, and then bracket notation, and this is telling it which value to delete. So when we do that, all of a sudden our object has been truncated and the hometown is just gone. Another option for getting rid of stuff is we could just reassign it to undefined. Now this looks a little different. You see the key is still in there, but there's no value. As far as which one to use, it really depends on the context and the project. So play it by ear, but they effectively do similar things. So either one will probably work for starters, but just know that both are options and both have subtle differences. So this all probably felt pretty familiar. The delete was kind of new, but we're using this familiar bracket notation. But now it's time to get out of your comfort zone, because I'm actually going to tell you that usually you wouldn't use bracket notation in this way. You can, but generally you want to use something called dot notation. And this doesn't look like what you've seen with an array. So let me show you what I mean. We're going to do exactly the same thing, but in a different way. So if I wanted to get my hometown, I would do my.info dot hometown. So notice that I haven't put hometown in quotes. If I did that, we'd get an error. It's just the name. So we have the name of our object dot the name of our property. And just so you know, the word key and property is interchangeable. So I might use both. You'll hear people use both. So my.info.hometown, and that gives us Salt Lake. As you might expect, we could also use this to update. And exactly as we saw before, we can update it. And as you might guess, we can also delete this way. I won't demonstrate that. So as far as best practices go, you want to use the dot notation. The brackets may seem a little more comfortable because it's similar to the array, but I would stick with dot notation, except for this really cool case where sometimes we want to look at a value, but we don't know what it is. So this seems, without any context, this seems like kind of a weird case, but it actually comes up all the time. So say we have this variable called key name, and I'll go ahead and just set it to number. But maybe in a real world application, this variable is just coming to us from somewhere else, and we don't actually know what key name is set to. Or it might be set to multiple things depending on what's running our code. So we want to look up the number on my.info, but all we have is this key name. What's really cool is that using bracket notation, we can do that. So let's go ahead and see what we've got there. Awesome. So we were able to access the number using a variable that referred to the property. So if we use dot notation here, it would get really confused because it'd be looking for an actual property called key name, which there is none. But when we use bracket notation, we're able to plug a variable in there. So let's go over that again, because we just saw 3 different ways of looking up, reassigning, deleting. The first one was bracket notation, where we just plugged on in the actual name of the key, like email. Normally, we wouldn't do this, but we can. The other way we can find what a value is dot notation. This is a much better way to do it if we explicitly know which key we're looking for. And then the final way is bracket notation, but with a variable. So this is the case where you actually would want to use bracket notation. And sure enough, we're able to get the value just with this variable. And just as one more thing to throw at you, this will not work. We don't want a string that says key name. We want the actual variable itself. So those are the basics of looking stuff up, deleting, changing. As I kept saying last night, you might be feeling overwhelmed right now. Don't worry about it. You don't have to have every single piece of syntax memorized. We don't expect you to. We would be extremely impressed if you did, but the internet is out there. It is your friend. You're perfectly welcome to Google this and look up how this works as you're using it and refer to this video, and just be patient with yourself while you memorize all this. What's far more important is that you understand it conceptually. So now that we've seen a little bit about objects, I actually wanted to go over the arguments object, because that was something that we tried to go over last night. There were a few technical difficulties, but honestly, I'm kind of glad, because I think that this is a better moment for us to cover it, because it is actually an object, and we just learned what objects are. So let's go ahead and write a function really quickly here. And then I'll go ahead and call it down here. So inside a function, we have a keyword called arguments. Notice that if I try and use that keyword outside of a function, we get a reference error. It's not defined. But inside a function, it is. So we want to know what it is. Let's go ahead and log it for starters. So right now, it is an empty object, just a couple of curly brackets. But if I start to throw things inside of this function call, a couple of strings, and maybe even a number for good measure, all of a sudden, look, we have an object. So this thing is technically an object, but it is an array-like object. Notice that the keys are just numbers. And that means that we can use it exactly like we're used to using arrays. So we can go ahead and instead of logging all of it, we could do, let's say, arguments at index 0. And now we just get the first one. That's cool. But notice that if we try to do something like arguments.pop, which we know is a method on arrays, we get an error. And that's because arguments isn't really an array. It's an array-like object. So for right now, all you need to know is that you can look up using this indexing, but you can't use methods. And that's arguments for you. Really useful thing. It allows us to write functions with arguments. Okay. So that was a little bit of an aside, but let's go back to diving into objects in a little bit more detail. So I'm glad that we just went over that, because that brought us to methods, which is the next topic for objects. So we saw with our arrays last night that not only were we able to do indexing, look things up, we were also able to use all these awesome built-in methods like pop and push and unshift. And that was part of the power of the data structure, was not only could we store data, but we can manipulate it in these awesome built-in ways. So you're probably thinking to yourself, well, what are the awesome built-in methods that we can do with objects? So objects are actually a little bit different. There are built-in methods. One example, let me go ahead and create us an object real quick. So here's a little object again. So for example, my info does have a method called a string. And as a little reminder, we know it's a method because it's a function. So whereas properties.length, like .length, you would just say .length, and you have it with a method, you always have to call it because it's a function. So just visually, you know it's a method when you're required to use the parentheses afterwards. So let's see what this does. And this is what I kind of mentioned before, that sometimes you just see object, and it's not very useful. So this is a method we have, but it's not object specific. So for example, if I just had a string called hello, well, that's not very interesting, a string to string. Let's do a number. So if we do number dot to string, And it turns out that every single thing in JavaScript has a toString. So this toString thing isn't really that useful for objects itself, though it does exist. So that's kind of a bummer, right? With arrays, we had all these built-in functionality that really helped us, but with objects, that doesn't quite seem to be there. But never fear, there is a plus side, which is that with objects, we tend to write our own methods. So that's really cool. So for example, if we wanted to add a method onto my info, we could just say myinfo dot say name. And then we can do whatever we want with this. So actually, let's just make this say hi for now. And then we could console.log. Hello there. So now my info has say hi on it, and we can call it. So up here, this is an important distinction and one that's easy to confuse at the start, which is over here we actually declared the function. We can tell because we use the function keyword. And so this was all about writing the logic behind what the function does, what the method actually does when we call it. Over here, we're just utilizing it. So awesome, we were able to use this customized method called say hi. Notice that I tacked this on using dot notation here. I could also go ahead and throw it directly into the original object. Except now my tabbing is all messed up. So I've done exactly the same thing, just use different syntax. And it still works. So let's pause for a moment here because I know that this is starting to get a little hairy. So what's going on here? It's really the same thing as what we've seen already. So we picked a name, we picked a key, then we had a colon, and then we have what's called an anonymous function, which is just the function keyword, followed by parentheses, followed by the brackets with the logic inside. So when you guys learned about writing functions, you already saw a little bit of this. It's the same thing. It's just plopped inside of an object, which can be a little visually overwhelming, especially when all of this is so new. But once again, don't worry about memorizing the syntax. You have tons of resources online. You have this video to refer to, and we have people standing by in Slack to help you out if all else fails. So this is how you create a method instead of just, and now we can use it as much as we want. So that is really great. Now let's look at a slightly more interesting method. So instead of say hi, let's make this say name down here. So instead of just saying hello, I would like to introduce myself. And I could go ahead and, of course, hard code in. That works. But what if I decided to change the name to nickname? That didn't change the function, of course, because it's hard coded in. Or what if this is someone totally different, like Dan? That definitely isn't very sophisticated. So what are we going to do? Well, there are a couple different options. One is that we can refer to that property. So I can say myinfo.name. So what I've done is I've referred to the object itself inside of this function. So now instead of hard coding in the name, it's going to look back and say, hey, what is this set to? Oh, that goes on the outside. And then if I change this to someone else, function updates automatically. So that is one way to do it. Another way is the keyword this. So inside of an object, we can use the keyword this, and it's saying whatever object we're inside of, find the property name on that. And sure enough, it works exactly the same. We update name, it updates. Now you might be wondering, well, why would I use this keyword if I could just refer to the name of the function? It might be a little more clear what I'm talking about. All I'll say right now is that while yes, in this case, you don't need the keyword this, there definitely are cases where it becomes critical. I'm not going to go into what those are, but I just wanted to introduce you to the keyword because we're going to be seeing a lot more of this in lessons to come. So I wanted to just introduce you to it, show you how it works, and keep that one on the back burner of your mind because you will be seeing it more, and unfortunately, it's one of the confusing ones. So be prepared for that. Fun things to come. All right, so my last topic in terms of using objects is going to be looping. We saw that we can use our for loops for arrays, and it's awfully handy because let me go ahead and write that out actually. So create an array for us. Arrays are so meaningful. So we could do for let I equals 0 less than array.length. And then, we could, if we just wanted to console log all of the items in here, we could do that. So we loop through, and sure enough, we log everything in our array. So what made this really useful in terms of the array data structure is, first of all, we have this length property. That's awfully useful because it tells us when to quit our loop. And then we have the indexing. So we can look everything up by number. So for loops work great for arrays. And you guys might have already noticed why this isn't going to work for an object. We don't have a length, and we don't have a way of looking things up by numbers. So luckily, there's a special kind of loop that is just for objects. It's called the for in loop, and it's very similar. So the syntax looks like this. For, let's key in my info. So instead of, it's actually easier to write a for in loop. There's literally less text you have to type. So all you have to do is declare a variable name. This could be anything. We could call this variable Steve if we wanted. That would be confusing. Don't do that. You almost always call it key. That's kind of like I is the convention for your for loop. Key is the convention for in. And then you say whatever the name of your object is. So let's go ahead and see what happens there. If we log key. Sure enough, all the keys inside of our object have been logged. So that's useful, but what about the values? Often we care more about the values that are in our object. The keys are just a labeling system. Notice that there is no variable called value, but it's not that bad because of that bracket notation I showed you. So let's go ahead and keep logging our key. And then we can also log a value just like that. So we don't know what key is. And in fact, as it iterates, this variable is going to change, but we can still use it to look up whatever is inside of my info. So notice it went through for the first one. We had a key. Actually, let me add some colons. It'll be just a little more readable. So we had first the key name and the value Deandra. Then we had the key job. The value is teaching you lovely people. And finally, we had the key say name, which is our method, and the value, it actually went ahead and logged the entire function for us. So that's really great. We were able to access every single thing that exists inside of this object with just a simple loop. So let's go ahead and do a little compare contrast between the for and the for in loop. So the for loop is all about order, right? Because we're able to loop through increasing this I value. So for loops, you generally have some sort of number that's incrementing, which is really great for looking up things in an array. Whereas the for loop, or the for in loop, just goes through and finds our key value pairs. So this one's great for objects. This one's great for arrays. You definitely cannot loop through, well, technically you can loop through an object using a for loop, but it's a little convoluted. And I'm not going to show you that because that is bad practice and I don't want it in your heads. So what about looping through an array with a for in loop? That might be a little tempting. Let's go ahead and see what happens. Why not? And I will say before we go any further that this, I'm going to kind of contradict myself here because this is also bad practice. You do not actually want to do this, but I'm personally a believer that when someone tells you not to do something, they should tell you why. So we're going to explore that a little bit. Okay, so now instead of my info, we're looking at our array. Okay, so we see that those indices actually are the keys, and the value is what we actually put into the array. So that's cool. Seems to work all right. So why don't we want to do this? Well, it's a little tempting to do it because oftentimes it does work similar to a for loop, but there are cases where this can get kind of convoluted. I don't want to show you because, well, I can show you one quick example. So if I went ahead and added another value to the array at index 5, we see that we have index 0, 1, 2, and 5, but 3 and 4 have kind of just disappeared. If we do our for loop instead, they're undefined, but at least they're being logged. And this is really the preferred behavior because in this type of array, you want to think about if we have something at index 5, then it has a length. It has a length of 6, even if not all the values are defined. So we really would want a loop to show us every single thing that's in here, all 6 items, even if some of them don't have a definition. So that is one of the reasons why a for in loop is really not good for arrays, because this makes it seem like there's only 4 items in it, and that's not quite accurate. So there are other reasons not to use a for in loop for arrays, but they're a little more advanced, so we won't get into them. But since we're breaking the rules already, let's go ahead and do something even crazier. So I'm going to create a string, and I'm going to loop through this. My word, this seems awfully strange. I mean, a string isn't even a data structure, right? So is this going to work? Let's find out. And holy cow, it actually did. So we have our keys as these numbers and these values as the actual character values inside of our string. So that's kind of cool and interesting and maybe a little weird. Let's make it a little weirder. What if I had a Boolean? So that wasn't that exciting, right? It didn't log anything, but it didn't crash either. And that's probably this, if you really think about it, the strangest thing, right? So these for in loops, they're not meant to be used with arrays. They're not really meant to be used with strings and definitely not with Booleans, but why aren't we getting an error? Aren't we getting some feedback telling us to quit it? And so this is maybe the first indication that something a little strange is going on here. And in fact, we're about to have a twist ending to this lesson. So I want to direct your attention to a couple other strange things that you may or may not have noticed throughout. The first is that when creating this object, I said that name, the key value, could also be called the property. Let me actually get rid of some of this junk on the screen. It's getting a little cluttered. So I said that we have this property called name. But remember, with arrays and strings, we also had a property called length. Doesn't it seem a little strange that in one case, the word property refers to something that's built in, whereas in this case, property refers to something that we're building ourselves? Same thing with method, right? Array.pop was called a method. That was something that was built in for us. Down here, myinfo.sayName is also called a method, but that's something we created ourselves. So you might be thinking, okay, this is just a really confusing naming convention, and whoever created JavaScript probably just wanted to foil anyone who is learning it and make their lives hard. But that's not it at all. There's actually a very good reason why we use the word property in both cases, why we use the word method in both cases, and why the for in loop worked on everything, even though it maybe didn't work in a particularly useful way on arrays or strings, or especially not Booleans. And that reason is that everything is an object. So this is definitely an object, but our array is an object too. And our string is also an object. Now, this sounds a little bit like some sort of crazy stoner logic of like the eternal oneness of all JavaScript things, and I'm enlightened and I realize that everything deep down is just an object, but this actually is a very meaningful concept. It's a difficult but an important thing to grasp. So bear with me, and if it doesn't make perfect sense by the end of this lecture, that's perfectly okay, and in fact, expected. So what do I mean when I say an array is actually an object? Because didn't I just teach you that there's a data structure called an array and something called an object? Well, think about it like this. Deep down, an array is actually an object. At the core, it's an object, but it's wearing an array costume. And so it has all this additional functionality, a special way of declaring it, all these built-in properties and methods that make it an array. So, for example, the fact that we declare it using these hard brackets, that's part of the array costume. The fact that we can do something like array.pop is part of the array costume. But underneath that, an array is still an object. Same thing with a string. So the string, we declare it in a specific way using quotes and then filling it with text, and it also has properties like the dot length. And that is part of the string costume. The fact that we can use all of these, that we declare it in this way, or that we can use dot length. But deep down, a string is actually also an object. So then what about this thing? This thing that I told you was called an object. This thing is, not only is it deep down an object, it's also not wearing a costume. So if we think about programming as being like a play, then this object is the narrator. It's not pretending to be anything else. It doesn't have any dressing. It's being completely upfront about what it is. So it has all the built-in objectness, like that toString method. Everything has that because everything is an object, but it doesn't have any extra frills on top of it. So when we use the word object, we can use it in two different ways. The vast, vast majority of the time that you hear someone say object, they're talking about this kind of thing. They're talking about something that we declare with curly brackets, and then we explicitly give it key value pairs, and so forth. So everything we've talked about tonight is usually what someone means when they say an object. But it's important to know that secretly, these guys are also objects too. And you've probably heard the phrase object-oriented programming. And technically, JavaScript isn't an object-oriented language, but it was modeled after object-oriented languages. And the concept of what truly makes something an object-oriented language is a whole nother rabbit hole. But part of it is the fact that everything is really an object. So like a lot of the things that we're introducing you to in this mini boot camp, this isn't something we expect you to master. This isn't something we expect you to fully grasp right now. And it's really far more important at this stage that you understand what an object is in the more casual sense of the word. It's a data structure that you declare using curly brackets, and you put in key value pairs, and you can add properties, you can add methods. That's the most important takeaway of this lesson. But keep in the back of your mind that secretly, everything else is also an object too. And if you just kind of keep that floating in there, don't worry about it too much, everything will kind of start to come together as you get more comfortable with this. So hopefully that wasn't too mind-boggling. And hopefully you guys are feeling a bit more comfortable on how to use these objects and create this labeled data and build your own methods, which is all extremely useful. Great things. One of my favorite data structures. Though I'm just kind of a data nerd, so I love data structures, so I might be biased in this regard. Well, that is all I have to teach you tonight. We do have an assignment, as always. That'll give you a chance to play around with objects a little bit. But we do have a little bit of time left, so let me go ahead and open this up to questions. So if you guys have any questions, go ahead and jump in Slack, throw them in there, and I will address them. I'm not seeing any questions. That either means that you guys are experts in this, or that I've blown your mind so hard with this everything is secretly an object thing that you're just holding your heads in existential crisis. But I'm going to go ahead and assume that it's the first one and that you guys are all ready to call it a night and jump into your homework. So thank you for sticking with me tonight, and I hope you learned a thing or two about objects and how to use them.